welcome to Debbie's back porch. So glad to have you with us again. This is March the 14th, 2016, and we are celebrating National Pie Day. Yay! And we're celebrating National Pie Day by cooking potatoes. Yes, I know. Actually, what we're going to make is a cottage pie. And you start that out with your potatoes. So I have about 1.5 pounds of potatoes in water. Gonna boil those kind of nice and slow. And I put a whole teaspoonful of salt in. Actually, I think I'm gonna put just a little bit more. 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Salt's important with potatoes because potatoes are a fairly bland tasting food without seasoning. They're good, they're kind of bland, and if you really want your potatoes to be flavorful, you add some salt while you're cooking. So we're going to let these boil for a while. I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you how I make a cottage pie, tell you a little of the history. It's pretty interesting. Right. Cottage pie, myth 1. A cottage pie is not a variation of a shepherd's pie. No, au contraire. A shepherd's pie is a variation of a cottage pie. When cottage pies were introduced, it was in the 1700s, the 18th century. And it was cottage pies, and it was a pie with potato crust, sometimes even on the bottom, not just the top, using any roasted meat. That's the second myth. Ground lamb, ground beef. When they were first introduced in the first cookbooks that showed them, it was leftover roasted meat and leftover broth. So my variation on that is canned ground beef. I actually was going to use canned beef chunks, but I was out. So I'm going to strain the broth out of this, and I'm using 2 pints, and this is my canned, home canned ground beef. And yes, there's a little fat in this. We always try to get as much fat out as we can, but it is the very nature of meat to have fat mobilized through it, so I suppose you could get it all out, but a little bit won't hurt, as long as it's not a thick layer of meat. So we're straining this, a thick layer of fat. We're straining this, and I'm going to use as many canned items as I can. And there's a reason for that. Cottage pie was poor people's food. It came about when potatoes were actually being introduced in Europe, and they were considered a poor people's food. And so cottage pie was something that was made out of potatoes and leftovers, and it has taken on its whole sort of aura now. But cottage pie is really just good, stick to your bones food, and it was something that folks thought of as wintertime food, when you could use any kind of veggies you wanted. There was no strict recipe for cottage pie. It was for you to use up what you had to feed your family. Our canned ground beef. I'm going to use some canned carrots. I have some frozen peas. I'll use fresh what I have, but as we go along, hold in mind, you can make this your own. You can use whichever vegetables you have. There's a little bit of difference in how you would use the vegetables based on whether they're fresh, canned, or frozen. And I'll sort of mention that as I go along. So let's get started with our cottage pie. Okay, here is my pre-cooked, my home canned ground beef. And down in the bottom you'll see I've retained the broth. I probably won't need half of that. But I saw no sense in opening a can of broth when I had all that wonderful beef broth there. Here is my favorite Pequot, and I don't mean that it's the favorite of all my Pequots. That's the brand, Favorite Pequot. Pretty old cast iron skillet, and I like to use it in something like this because I'm going to actually finish the pie, bake it in this pan, and this pan is the only one I have that has really nice straight high sides, but you can use any one you want. So I'm putting this ground beef in, fat and all. If you're using a really lean meat, you need to start out by adding a little bit, not much. You can use lard, you can use a little butter, you can use oil, olive oil, whatever oil you want to use, but just a little bit, just enough to keep it from sticking. Because eventually this is going to get baked, and any excess fat in there is going to bubble up in your stove. And we're going to put butter in the potatoes. So spread it out. I've got it on a little over a medium heat. This was browned before I put it in the jar to can it, assuming that you're using either fresh ground beef or some leftover roasted meat. You want to let it brown a little bit more. We'll be back. Okay, we're getting some nice brown on this. Not a lot of fat down in there. So let's talk about seasonings. I generally season each different part. So the potatoes have salt, but most of that's going to get rinsed off. So I'm going to sprinkle about a half a teaspoonful of salt in here. And I'll taste it again before I actually put the pie together. I'm going to sprinkle just a little bit of red bell pepper. I'm sorry, red pepper flakes. Traditionally, you would add some rosemary and or some thyme. I'm leaving it out this time because Fred asked me to leave it out. But you want to put a little fresh rosemary or dried rosemary, a little thyme, because that's traditional, the flavor. Why? Because people grew it out in their yards, in their garden. They could get these things wild. And because it's good. So, any other herbs you want to add, you may. Add a tablespoonful of minced garlic. If you're using fresh, that would be about 2 cloves. Now I'm going to add my raw veggies, which in my case is just going to be onions and celery. Normally it would include carrots, but I'm using canned carrots and I'll add those later. And we've got this on a pretty low heat. We're going to let those cook until you start to smell them and they get translucent. Now, I did these in my new food processor. This is a little bit finer, a little smaller chop than I would do by hand. This is my first time to do this. Normally I would chop those in, I don't know, maybe 1/4 inch chunks. But this is your pie. You do it however you like. Okay, I've let this all brown a little bit. The onions and celery are becoming translucent, letting that flavor out. If you'll see, this is kind of dry. I cautioned you against too much fat at the start. And now we're going to add just a little bit. And I'll show you why. I get a little olive oil here. You know I don't use olive oil for frying. This is not frying. I'm going to put a little olive oil right there in the middle. That was a couple tablespoons full. And there's a little fat in the meat. And I'm going to add here a couple tablespoons full of flour. And then I'm going to stir that all through. If you had fat left from the meat you were using, you didn't need to add any. We just want to make this creamy, and we want it to have a sauce. And so that's why we added a little fat and a little flour. And I'm going to let that sizzle for about 1 minute. We're back. It's been about a minute. And what's going to be difficult for you to see is how that little bit of fat and flour changed the texture. This has become soft and creamy. So from the broth that I had left from the meat, I'm going to add, from the canned meat, I'm going to stir in about a cup, but I'm doing it about a 1/4 cup at a time. And if your meat didn't have the broth, you can use chicken broth. Like if you started out with ground beef and you cooked it from scratch. You can add some of your home canned bone broth. You can add chicken broth. You can add vegetable broth. We just want some flavorful liquid there. So that's about a cup. Okay, here are my home canned carrots. These are baby carrots. They're in big chunks. Sliced carrots are fine. I'm going to cut these up into a little bit smaller chunks. Now see again, if you were using fresh carrots, you would put them in at the same time as your celery and onions. We're going to add some peas here too, and if you were using fresh peas, they would go in right after your celery and onions. And I have a 1/2 cup of frozen peas here. Okay, you're going to have to make a judgment call here, because I want this to simmer for about 20 minutes or so. I want the flavors to be cooked together, and this is kind of dry. So you're going to check on it all along, and if you think it's going to start sticking, you can add just a little bit more of the broth in, say, tablespoonful increments. Because this is going to be baked in the oven and it's likely to cook out, we don't want it to be too very juicy when we put it in, but we don't want it to scorch in the meantime. So low heat. I'm going to get a lid, and I'm going to let this simmer for about 15 minutes, and while it's simmering, I'm going to make the potatoes. Of course, you know, this would not be one of my videos if we didn't forget something. So it's good to check on it anyway. See how it's bubbling there? You need to add a hint of something tomatoey. I have here my home canned tomato ketchup, which will add a little sweet flavor too. And I'm putting a couple tablespoons full, maybe 3. You can use tomato paste. You can actually just add some tomatoes to it. But I have lots of home canned ketchup, and so we're going to use that. Not sticking, so I'm not going to add any more broth. And sticking a little bit there. Just stir. And this is a good opportunity to give it a little taste. Make sure we have enough salt, pepper. Okay, before I start mashing the potatoes, I'm going old school here with my old box grater. I have here a chunk of real Parmigiano Reggiano cheese, and I'm going to grate up a lot of it. And I'm not afraid of pre-grated cheese. I don't think that it's terrible for your health, but it just doesn't taste as good. And if you use a jar of Parmesan cheese for this, you're going to be not as happy with the results. I mean, for one thing, it's not real Parmesan. Because in this country, if you want real Parmesan, you have to find something that's marked Parmigiano Reggiano. And you're generally going to get that in a chunk. Not enough. Gonna do it all. Okay, well, I have quite a little mess going on here. That's okay. I have some potatoes. And yes, you see some dark spots. And that's because I didn't get all the skins off. Which I don't think is important. But if that drives you crazy, you make sure you get them all off. So, these are still hot. And we're going for a little bit different texture here than you normally would with mashed potatoes. We want something a little bit firmer. And I'm going through it with a fork first to make sure I don't have any uncooked lumps. Because we don't want a lump of cooked potato is fine. We don't want any uncooked lumps. And I have probably a bigger bowl than I needed, and that's on purpose too. Okay, I have a stick of butter. And it should have been a stick of room temperature butter, but it wasn't because I forgot to set it out. So I put it in the microwave for 15 seconds. That's why you see some of it melt. And you can use an immersion blender if you want to. I generally don't. I mash potatoes by hand. I don't like what that does to the starch. Somewhere I have a regular old-fashioned potato masher. I'm going to taste for salt. Before I go any further. That's not here. You notice I haven't added any milk. And that's on purpose. That's not one of those things I have forgotten. Gonna mix that cheese in while it's still hot. Let it start melting. I have here 1 egg yolk. And I have a little half and half. Heavy cream would be better. I don't have any heavy cream, so we're going with half and half. And I'm going to put a couple ounces of half and half in with my egg yolk. And then we're going to beat, beat, beat. And then we'll pour that in. And we're now going to cream this. Okay, this is way thicker than you would make mashed potatoes for your table. I think it's thicker than I make them for mine. And there are some tiny little chunks of fully cooked potato in there. And I tasted it, and it's scrumptious. So I'll meet you back at the stove. I turned this off a few minutes ago, and as I said, we're making this directly in this skillet. So I want to clean it up a little bit, you know, because I'm a notoriously messy cook. But I guess it doesn't matter since I'm the one that cleans the kitchen. Most of the time. Fred has been known to clean the kitchen. So we're making it nice and flat on purpose. I'm not just playing with my food. And I have a couple of spots on the rim. I have a clean cloth. Clean damp cloth. I'm going to wipe that away. Okay, now the potatoes. They're very stiff. And we don't want to disturb our filling. And I'm actually going to make the potatoes pretty thick on this. So, big lump. By the way, if you don't use all of these potatoes, there could be potato patties in your future. And they would be wonderful with that little bit of cheese. So big lumps. And a clean fork that I, by the way, am dipping in the leftover broth. You could dip it in water, but you dip it to keep it from sticking. And pull it all the way to the edge. Because even though it's potato, it's still crust, and you want to seal it. I have my oven heating to 375. Okay, let's clean this little spot off over here, because that'll just burn and be ugly. Now this is a personal preference, but this will cook better if it's not smooth. Because what we want is some nice, tender potatoes that have just a hint of crunch. And this last cooking is just to achieve that, because everything in here is done. So peaks and valleys and nooks and crannies help it brown. And And I think I'm done. Have a little bit of leftover potatoes that go in the refrigerator. Little leftover broth that will go in. And this is going in the oven for 25 minutes, but I will check it before 25 minutes because I don't want the potatoes to burn. I just want them to brown. Well, here you go, fresh out of the oven. As my dad used to say, that's beautimous. One change in the cooking directions, actually two. You should put this on a cookie sheet because it does bubble up. And the second thing is, after 20 minutes, I moved it to the broiler for 5 minutes to get that nice little crust on top. And we're gonna let this sit now for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll plate it up for you. Well, I've waited the obligatory 10 minutes, and it was hard, but I always remember if you don't wait, then you'll burn your mouth. So here is cottage pie. I'll say again, this is not shepherd's pie. All shepherd's pie is cottage pie, but not all cottage pie is shepherd's pie. I'm sorry, you can forget I said that. So cottage pie to me sort of embodies all of the principles of home cooking from scratch. It's using what you got and making something wonderful. It isn't fancy, but I think it's elegant. So let's serve a little bit of this up. And this crust is nice and crispy. And underneath the crust, the potatoes are fluffy and tender. And you can see the meat is caramelized and the vegetables are cooked in. And the flavors are going to run all through this. Lucky me. I get to taste it. Still pretty warm. Tastes like coming home after a long trip. Tastes like visiting Mama's house. Tastes like the whole family together on a winter evening. Cottage pie. Happy St. Patty's Day. Happy National Pie Day. See you tomorrow.